for inviting me to talk this evening. And the talk's going to be very informal. I'm not a folklorist or a historian or an expert, and basically I'm a player, not even a traditional player. I'm a classically trained player who moved from Winnipeg in 1978 to Prince Edward Island, and
showed good taste. Let's have
and my first experience on Prince Edward Island with the traditional music was just something incredibly exciting and something that I'll remember for a long time. When I first came here, there was two wonderful fiddle players who were playing, Kim Vincent and David Papazian. Before I introduced David, though, some of the other players I met at the time, Margie Carmichael, Michael Mooney, Fay Pound, John Martin, Marty Reno, Gene McClellan, and of course Lenny Gallant, all playing traditional music and some traditional instrumental music that was Irish influenced. But of course, being a fiddle player, I was drawn to the traditional fiddling. I joined the Prince Edward Island Fiddler Society. But the people who really excited me about the music were Kim and David. Living on the Dixon Road in rustic hand-built wooden houses, they were obsessive about the music. They ate, drunk, and slept fiddle music 12 hours a day. They would be practicing, learning new tunes, transcribing tunes, and later in the evenings a group of people would drop by and there would be a musical jam. It would go late into the wee hours of the morning. And the music that these two fiddlers were so passionate about was the music of Ireland. And I have never experienced anything quite like those sessions, and even today they're very rare. But those initial experiences with the parties along the Dixon Road and Hunter River and the odd party up in Charlottetown here inspired me to take up playing traditional Irish fiddle. And unfortunately, I never found that kind of dynamic energy or dedication to the music in any other fiddle players on the island. And I never heard any other fiddle players playing with traditional Irish influences in their music. That is, with the ornamentation and bowing of Irish players. And we'll sort of try to demonstrate some of that a bit later. There are a few Cape Breton players who were influenced by the Irish styles. Johnny Wilmot is one. Johnny Wilmot just passed away, I think, this past year. And certainly some of the younger players, like Natalie McMaster, I'm sure you've all heard of, Kyle McNeil of the McNeil family, the Barra McNeils. They all play Irish music. They have a love for it. But they all play with Cape Breton and Scottish stylings and bowings. I've often wondered why this was the case. If one peruses the repertoire of the PEI Fiddler Society, one does find Irish dance tunes there. For example, the jigs, Irishman's Heart to the Ladies, Paddy in London are there. Reels such as Paddy on the Turnpike, which is probably an Americanized version of a traditional reel. Sheehan's Reel. The Star of Munster, although not an official repertoire, is played by some fiddlers on the island. There are even a few hornpipes in the PEI Fiddler Society repertoire, the Belfast and the Dundee. There are no slip jigs or slides, which are native to Ireland. So we have tunes which suggest an Irish influence, but as we will see later, many of the so-called Irish named tunes, particularly the reels, were often borrowed by Irish players and renamed. But having admitted that there still is this nagging question, why do none of the players here play with Irish style or ornamentation? At least none that I have heard. What could be some of the reasons? Perhaps there were few players who came from Ireland initially. Perhaps the access to written music made Scottish tunes more popular. It was only with the publishing of Francis O'Neill's very popular Music of Ireland in 1903 and the Dance Music of Ireland in 1907 that a widespread distribution of Irish music would have been available. And I have the reprint there, O'Neill's Music of Ireland, which was printed in the 70s, 1970. Francis O'Neill was a flute player who lived in the Chicago area. The Dance Music of Ireland contained something like 1,100 fiddle tunes that he transcribed. And although the tunes were somewhat flawed in the transcriptions, they didn't have tape recorders in those days, the collection is acknowledged for its comprehensiveness, over 1,100 tunes in all. And since, as I mentioned, he was a flute player and knew many of the better traditional players in the United States, the tunes cover many of the counties in Ireland, although in the original version, the Sligo stylings were few. Rendering the stylistic variations was difficult. That is, trying to write them down on paper is very difficult, as it is to talk about the music itself, but we'll do our best tonight. And O'Neill, because he didn't know the names of a lot of the tunes, made them up. And there were a lot of duplicate tunes in the initial versions. However, this really popularized the traditional music, the publication of these two books. Earlier collections, such as Bunting's General Collection, which I have there, 1796, Ancient Irish Music, published in 1796, did little for the practice of traditional harp playing because he took liberties in transcribing the tunes, rendering the airs in impossible keys, that is, writing them in keys that players, traditional players, wouldn't be able to play, and adding accidentals, that is, specific notes in a tuning which wouldn't be normal for the harp. So the players couldn't play the tunes as they were written. Petrie's collection of Irish music, 1902 to 1905, and actually he collected over quite a long period, but this was one of the editions, I think. There was two editions published in 1902, 1905, concentrated on song airs almost exclusively, and only with reluctance did he include instrumental settings. And this, as I mentioned, was published in 1902 and 1905. So the earliest migrants coming from Ireland wouldn't even have had access to these publications to bring the tunes with them. Joyce's Old Irish Folk Music and Song, published in 1909, was the best of the collections, but again it emphasized vocal music and added non-traditional piano accompaniment. Now on the Scottish side, there were many collections of traditional instrumental music that were published, going way back into the late 1700s. Nathaniel Gow and Neil Gow published their collections. Skinner had several collections published. William Marshall. There was a Sky collection that was done. And these were very, very widely distributed. These were published much earlier than O'Neill's work, and in some instances a century or more earlier. And often these were written by the musicians themselves in settings appropriate for traditional music. So these were all factors, perhaps, why we don't see the Irish style playing on the island. As well, the nature of island house parties and dances may have been a factor. The strong driving pulse of the Scottish players being better suited to the dances, where a steady, constant beat was needed to keep the dancers moving, rather than the more fluid and ornamented style of the Irish playing. Maybe we'll never really know what happened to the traditional players who crossed the Atlantic from Ireland, but it's heartwarming to know that several young players are picking up an Irish style in their playing, thanks to the teaching here on Prince Edward Island of people like Kim Vincent and David Papazian, and access now to recorded music, which we're going to listen to very soon. But let's cross over to the Atlantic to see what we can learn from the traditional players and folklorists in Ireland. To take us across, we'd like to play you a slow air and a hornpipe. This is called Crossing the Sea to Ireland and the Rights of Man. Okay, the folklorists. This is the man, this is the high priest of traditional Irish music, Brendan Branagh, or something like Branagh. My Gaelic is not too good. This is the book, if you're really seriously interested in reading and learning about traditional Irish music. It's called Folk Music and Dances of Ireland. This is where I got quite a bit of the information for the talk tonight. This gentleman is acknowledged as one of the foremost authorities on the traditional music of Ireland. So, according to Brendan, there are 6,000 tunes, instrumental tunes, notated dance tunes, in the public archives in Ireland's Department of Education. And new material is apparently being constantly added. Most of this material has been composed in the last 3 centuries, the greater number belonging to the last half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. The debate over what is and what is not traditional is ongoing and probably will be around as long as the music survives. Brana takes initially a narrow approach in excluding any tune where the composer is known, as to distinguish this from orally passed on music where the original composer is no longer known, but the music has become accepted by the traditional community of players. To quote him, he says, "Folk music and song are the product of the folk and accordingly anonymous. This process starts with some one person, but since it is accepted by and becomes the property of the community and is passed on from generation to generation, it no longer possesses any features which link it with a particular school or class of composers. So we speak of it as anonymous." So at present, Irish traditional music includes not only the older songs and melodies of the Gael, but also the Anglo-Irish and English ballads of the countryside, and the extraordinary rich heritage of dance music, which belongs exclusively, to neither districts in which Irish or English is the spoken language of the people. So given that there are so many notated tunes, 6,000 tunes, that's an incredible pile of tunes, it is somewhat surprising to note that only very few of these are instrumental, in the sense of music played solely to delight the ear and not for marching or dancing. According to the ancient literature of Ireland, this was not always the case. Several ancient stories refer to the music being divided into thirds, and that these divisions referred specifically to instrumental music only. The 3 thirds were, and I have them written up there, I don't know if you can see them. Does somebody want to pronounce the Gaelic? The first one is slumber music. Seth, can you? Suntra? Shuntra? Shuntra. Okay, so that's the first third is the slumber music. The laughing music would be pronounced, how would you pronounce? Yes. Gainsra? Gainsra. And the last one, the last third, Goltra. Goltra. Crying music. So this is the references in the ancient literature to division of the music into instrumental music based on these 3 emotional categories. One story in the account of a battle fought between the piratical Forminians and Tuatha De Danann is related. It's related how one god, Dagda, the good god, effects the release of his harper, who has been carried off by the retreating pirates. Dagda pursues them to a cave where he sees his harp hanging on the wall. He plays the 3 musical feats: the Goltrai, until their women weep; the Gantrai, until the women and youths burst into laughter; and finally the Shantrai, until the entire host falls asleep and he rescues his harper and they escape. In other stories, the thirds are referenced to a three-stringed harp, the iron string producing a deep slumber, the brass string making the company merry, and the one of silver plunging everyone into sorrow. This division was mostly one of literary value and not really a formalized structure for the classification of music, but it did provide evidence for the performance of purely instrumental music. I'm going to pass over the early instrumentation, although as mentioned earlier, the harp had a prominent place, along with a small drum or tambourine. Fiddles were also mentioned in the ancient literature. It was not the violin, which wasn't introduced until the middle of the 17th century later, but it was a bowed instrument. There was a profusion of wind instruments made from reeds, animal horns, and of course the pipes. That is a type of bagpipes. Apparently, the harper enjoyed an ennobled status, whereas unfortunately the pipers and to some extent the fiddlers were regarded as inferior professions. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the structure of the music now. Slow airs, which very few of them are actually learned traditionally, that is passed on from orally or by ear from one player to another. Most of them are learned from written sources. And unfortunately, because of that situation, a lot of them aren't played with the same kind of phrasing and bowing and timing that the traditional airs were played. And there's a reference in the republication of O'Neill's book here. The gentleman who republished them didn't publish any of the airs because he felt the settings and the transcriptions weren't appropriate to the music, and he really feels that that is something that somebody needs to take on and to actually be able to notate the traditional airs. I just recently learned an air. I don't know the name of it, but I learned it from the playing of Matt Cranich, who was an Irish player. And as you'll listen, you'll probably be able to hear the phrasing and the timing is more open. It's more like speech, not regimented and formalized as modern music is, with really definitive bar like rhythm timing. So we'll give it a try. Matt Cranich's air. Okay, so now something a little more lively. We're going to move into some of the dance pieces. The jigs. I've often thought that jigs were native to Ireland in the sense of actually the dance started and the music started out of Ireland, but apparently there's no definite proof to say that, although certainly most of the jigs that have been composed were composed in Ireland. It has been suggested that the jig is of Italian origin, from giga. This apparent is a reference to the Irish piper and composer Turlough O'Carolan, who was composing around the 1600, well, he was born, I think, around 1604. But apparently the jig already was in Ireland as a dance before 1604, before O'Carolan introduced the Italian giga. We're going to play a medley of jigs for you. This one is called, these are called Banish Misfortune, The Connachtman's Rambles, and Smash the Windows. Just a brief note on the rhythm of the jig. The timing of the jig is in 6/8, so the basic rhythm is the triplet. So you can see whether you can hear the 6/8 rhythm in the jigs. We might play something on the boron to give you a little bit of an idea of how the rhythm goes. But here's this medley. Playing the traditional banjo. The ancient.
called a Bower, and there's a couple of makers on the island that are interested in buying one. Wonderful way to pass the cold winter evening. Okay.
I got my commercials in. You might as well mention who makes them.
Yes. Vian Emery and Brendan Glass are two of the makers I know that on the island, so pick up one. Okay, we mentioned jigs. There's single jigs, double jigs, slip jigs, slides, which are also jigs, well, in jig rhythm. The main difference between single jigs and double jigs is the way the tune starts. As I mentioned, the jig is in 6/8. The way that can be broken down, you can have one note that can go for the whole 3 beats. You can have 3 notes for 3 beats. You can have one note for 2 beat and one note for the 3rd beat. And in a single jig, the first note counts 2 beats. So it goes, instead of, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it goes 1, 2, and that's the first note. Bum, ba. So I'll just quickly play a little bit. So it's, so can you hear, there's every once in a while there's one note that's held longer, that's 2 beats. So when the dancer does those kind of single jig dances, they only tap their foot once instead of twice. So you can come out to the Irish dancing on Wednesday night and learn how to do it, because I don't know how to do it. Okay, we're going to play slip jig for you now. It's believed that the slip jigs originated in Ireland, and that according to Petrie, they were a instrumental version of songs that were sang. Now these are written in 9/8, so you've got 3 groups of 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And we're going to play one, it's called The Butterfly. You can just sort of hear it fluttering around. That tune, I don't know whether you would have noticed, but there's 3 separate parts in that tune. Most tunes, usually like the reels and the jigs, only have an A part and a B part. You play the A part once, it's 8 bars, you play the A part again, you repeat it over. Then you play the B part, 8 bars, and then you repeat it. So the form of the tune is A-A-B-B. Does everybody follow that? And the slip jig that we played has 3 parts, and it's played A-A-B-B-C-C. And this tune was a bit unusual, and it's often what you'll find in the Irish music, is that the music is modal, that the tunes don't end on the note of the tonic of the key that it's in. So we're playing that last tune. It's in E minor, but the tune ends on a B note. And it doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel like the tune is finished. And apparently they were written this way because they would put several tunes together. And that ending phrase would be a lead-in phrase for the next piece, so that the dance would continue. The other thing I mentioned earlier about the ornamentation, one of the key elements of the ornamentation in Irish music is what's called a roll. And I don't know if you could see my fingers or what Seth is doing. In the instruments you play the rolls differently, but on the fiddle, the roll in the third part of the butterfly is on the B finger. And that's actually 5 notes that are played really quickly. So when you play it in the piece, it goes. So that's really a characteristic of the Irish playing. Now, on the banjo, the rolls sometimes, depending on the instrument, the pipes would play rolls similarly like that because of the fingering, but certain instruments you can't. How would you play a roll on the banjo, Seth? Do you want to show them?
It's not possible to play the
5, yeah.
because the instrument doesn't respond.
Doesn't respond, yeah.
The guitar would. The guitar you can get that roll because it's a looser string. This is a very tight string, so I have to go.
That's the third part. Yeah, and sometimes.
I'm really not doing as many notes as him, but I'm still trying to grace
To capture the character. And it's like with every instrument, it depends on the limitation of the instrument, how the ornament would be played. Okay. Yeah, where was banjos? It was harpers, and then it was pipers, and then it was fiddlers, and then I guess banjos were played for us at the bottom of the list. Yeah. All right. Okay. So as we mentioned, the slip jig developed from the Irish form of singing, but it's not definitely certain about that, because apparently when the first recorded tunes were written down, these slip jigs, the tunes in 9/8, were also found in England around the same time. We're going to play another tune that's in the jig rhythm, and this is called a slide, and this is in 12/8. But you'll still be able to hear those grouplets, the group of triplets. you can see that slowed down quite a bit, but hopefully you could still hear the 6/8 rhythm underlying it. Did you want to try that G minor one? Planksty Drew? This is another slow jig in 6/8. That piece we know was composed by Turlock O'Carolan, the harper, and it's called Planksty Drew. So that's not a traditional piece because we know the composer. Hornpipes. I always thought hornpipes were originally from Ireland, but I learned that they're of English origin around 1760. And they were introduced on the stage and danced between acts and scenes of plays. However, the Irish players and dancers have taken the hornpipe, the English hornpipe, and they've made it much more spirited than the English ever did. And we're going to hear some Irish players playing some hornpipes very soon, but the first medley I'd like to play from the recorded music are some reels. The reels originated in Scotland around the middle of the 18th century, apparently. But the tunes we have, the medley we have for you tonight is a wonderful player, Liz Carroll. She lives, I believe, in the United States. I think it's in Philadelphia area. She was All-Ireland champion and just an amazing player, amazing drive and energy. And listen for the rolls in her playing. These tunes are called Reel Beatrice and the Abbey Reel. Pretty amazing, eh? Boy. Wish I could play like that. Did you notice also all the slide notes that she plays? That's really characteristic of Irish playing, where the note will where they slide up on the note. So. So that's just another little thing to look for. Okay, I've got another medley of reels by another player, Brendan Mulvihill. his father, Martin Mulvihill, was apparently one of the great Irish players. Died not too long ago. Brendan Mulvihill, both the players I've picked tonight, and just because of the music that I had on the CDs, are living now in the United States. And Brendan Mulvihill actually is doing quite a bit of combining Irish music with classical music these days. But this piece here is one of his really wild reels, and you'll listen for the ornamentation. That there's more of what they call cutting in this tune, really quick bows, fast bows, but not the kind of rolls that we heard in the other playing. So this is track 8. It's called In and Out of the Harbor. Playing too. You notice there that about halfway through the tune it modulated keys, it changed, went to a higher key, and then he played the two parts against each other later, one with as a harmony to the first violin. He does do quite a bit of rolls there, but if you listen really carefully you'll hear some of those cuts I was talking about. So it's just really, really short bows. It just sounds almost like I can't do it very well, but it's sort of like. So it's just really short, quick, fast bows instead of the longer ornamentation, the longer roll. Okay, Strass bass. Most of us probably know they're of Scottish ancestry, but there's lots of Irish players who do like to play Strass bass. And I've got one here queued up, Sean Keane, who plays with the Chieftains, is going to play a Strass bass, Scottish Strass bass and a hornpipe. These are called the Marquis of Huntly, and a Scott Skinner tune, The Mathematician. You might have noticed that he was way up the fingerboard on the high string on those, particularly on the last tune there. It's unusual that a traditional player goes above what they call the first position, that is, the hand stays down at right against the end of the fiddle here. But on a piece like that, Keane would have been way up on the high strings there. Nose pickers, we call those ones. Okay. Set dances are solo dances, with usually several parts, sometimes with time changes. And if you want to learn how to do set dances, come out Wednesday night. Some tunes of the set dances are not in the AABB form. They have an uneven number of bars, not the usual 8, which indicated that at one time there were dances that were different than what we know today. We're going to play. How are we doing for time?
Keep going. We got all night.
We got time? 10 past already. We're getting close to the end. But we thought we should play some Irish polkas. Seth, did you want to say a little bit about these tunes out there?
Well, having grown up in Ireland myself, whenever you heard polkas, they were very unusual. Because we're used to the jigs and on hornpipes and reels. But didn't hear too many polkas, but they're very fast. And I grew up in a seaport town, and I can imagine. I know I met Polish sailors when I was growing up in my hometown who sang opera, and literally raised the roofs of the bars in town with paint glasses, playing just little fellas with great big voices. So I can imagine somewhere around 1600s or some sailor rolled into town on a ship with probably an early accordion from Poland or, I don't know. There's polkas in every country in Europe, and I'm sure the Irish knew a good thing when they heard it. So I think we're in tune here. We'll try a couple. These are, I don't know the names of these.
Great playing, Chuck. Okay, I just want to make a little comment on the naming of tunes. We called one of those tunes earlier Matt Kranich's Air, I mean. And that was often the way. A player who popularized the tune would get the name, so it would be Sean Potts' Jig, or it would be Tommy Peoples' Reel, because they often didn't remember the tunes or the names of the tunes, or they may often not have had names. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, the ornamentation varied quite considerably from county to county. I've never had a chance to get over to Ireland on my own, but I think we could hear some of the differences there, certainly between the playing of Sean Keane and the other two players, the nature of the roles and the ornamentation. And some of the earlier recordings, like by Michael Coleman, brought the Sligo type of fiddling, really popularized it. Unfortunately, the recordings also discouraged local players from holding on to some of the specific characteristics of their music. And they're, even today, more and more, with musicians traveling so much, the styles are blending in together. Another important factor in terms of the way the tunes were collected was the factor of language. And often, as I mentioned earlier, the tunes were written down by collectors that would impose their own musical structure on the tunes. And that was particularly apparent with Bunting, when he took the traditional harp tunes and placed them in keys that players couldn't play, that were totally inappropriate and not with the sensitivity to the ornamentation. So apparently the best transcriptions came obviously from people who were familiar actually with the local dialects, the local Gaelic dialects, because the phrasing is very, very important in particularly some of the slower airs and stuff like that. There was a comment in here about teaching the fiddle, but I think we'll just pass over it. If anybody's interested, they can come and read it from the book. But as we can see, what is traditional is constantly changing as the people, as musicians take up new instruments, introducing new instruments, new stylings, and new compositions. Brannock does admit at the end of his book that modern players composing in a traditional style and whose music is played by traditional players are expanding the repertoire of Irish traditional music. So we'd like to end off with a slow air. This tune called Sleeve Gallon Brace. It's a song. Seth played it for me night before last. I'm still learning it, but we're going to give it a try. And then we'll play a couple of, in the tradition of the music, and passing it on, and we'll play a couple of reels after that for you.
to these here young mountains and valleys so gay. I was thinking on these flowers, all a going to decay, that I found around you, bonny, bonny, sweet gallant brave. Up toward these mountains with my dog I have gone. I traveled these mountains for joy and for fun, but these days are now all over, for I can no longer stay. So farewell unto ye, bonny, bonny, sweet gallant brave. It's not for the want of employment I'm going, that causes the sons of dear old Ireland to roam. It's the taxes getting higher, and I can no longer stay. So farewell unto ye, bonny, bonny, sweet gallant brave.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll send you off with a couple of reels. This is Morning Dew, Pitching on the Gate, and the Tar Bolton. very much.
Roy Johnston, Seth Bobjoy. Boy, you can't get any better music than that. Any questions, Roy, and I imagine Seth as well? If you have a question for either or both of them, we'll entertain questions for a few moments. Anyone have a question on the music, the composers, the style, anything at all?
You would be able to give a demonstration that Roll give us with the music.
So the roll is 5 notes played real quickly. If it's on the first finger, it would be the first, third, first, open, first finger. So with the okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
You're waiting to get at the food, I can tell. You're all hungry. Okay, well, look, thank you all for coming out tonight. We didn't know what to expect. It was a real nasty night, and God, we almost got a full house.
Mention the books too, if people want to.
Yes, yeah, feel free. We're going to have some sandwiches and some coffee and tea. Stay around, chat, talk to Seth and Roy. Look at the books up here, and generally enjoy yourself. Stay as long as you want. I would remind you that anybody who's interested in banquet tickets, again, if you're not a member, leave your name, and if the members don't take them all up, we'll get back to you. Just leave your name with us. The other thing is, what is the other thing, Joe?
Shamrock's been live.
Oh, Joe McCabe has shamrocks for sale back there. If you want a shamrock for St. Paddy's Day, see Joe. And what's that? Yeah. And if you haven't already signed your name to get on our mailing list for future events and future lecture series, please do before you leave here. There's a sheet up there. We'd like your name and telephone number and so on. So, again, let's have one more round of applause for some fine musicians here. Now let's eat.